The Cascade Mountains had a way of swallowing sound at night. The snow wasn't just falling, it drifted, whispering as it landed, smothering every crack of branch and snap of ice. The moon broke through the pines in fractured beams, silver, light spilling across the ridges like water. Out here, winter was not just weather. It was silence, sharpened into something that could cut. Thomas Grayson trudged carefully through the snow, boots sinking deep, rifle balanced easily in his hands. At 45, his body carried the weight of years in uniform, broad-shouldered, steady, a man built by combat and scarred by it too. His beard was threaded with gray, his eyes the cold steel gray of storms at sea. He wasn't out here tonight for trophies. He was tracking a deer more out of discipline than hunger. It gave him purpose. It gave his dog purpose, too. At his side, Echo walked like a shadow. The old German shepherd, 10 years of service etched into every scar, moved silent as smoke. His coat was thick and dark, streaked with silver, his left ear forever bent from an explosion years ago. His back right leg bore a jagged scar where shrapnel had cut deep, but it hadn't slowed him much. Echo had been trained for war, and though his badge days were over, he had never stopped being a soldier. His eyes never stopped scanning. They'd been following deer tracks through the powder, the trail clear and fresh. Then Echo froze. His body went rigid, tail stiff, nostrils flaring, as he tasted something on the wind. A low growl rolled from his throat. Thomas halted, instincts flaring like a switch flipping on. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, rifle raising almost on its own. But Echo didn't wait. With a sudden burst, the shepherd veered off the game. Trail, bounding down a ridge, paws kicking up powder. "Damn it," Thomas muttered, crunching after him, every step careful but fast. Something told him this wasn't deer. At the bottom of a rocky shelf, the shadows deepened, and then Thomas saw it. Blood. It smeared across the snow in broken trails, dark and heavy. Echo was already nosing along the stains with urgency. Thomas knelt, fingers brushing the frozen crimson. Not animal, too thick, too much. The tracks beside it told another story. Boots dragging, staggered steps, someone half carried or half falling. Whoever it was, they were bleeding badly. The trail led into a hollow where ice had cracked, leaving a shallow cave. Echo slipped, inside first, whining low. Thomas followed, rifle steady. That's when he saw them. 2 men sprawled in the snow like broken dolls, both in uniform. The first lay on his side, barely conscious, pistol still clutched in his hand, though the slide had snapped clean off. His Navy patrol jacket was soaked through with blood at the shoulder, his leg twisted at an angle no man could walk on. His face was pale, jaw bruised, early 30s. This was Deputy Mike Lawson. The second man was on his back, motionless. Blood stained his chest and neck, a nasty gash across his forehead already freezing with ice. His storm-gray eyes were half-lidded beneath sweat and frost, his clean-shaven face slack. A gold badge glinted faintly on his belt. Officer Caleb Hart. "Damn it," Thomas muttered under his breath, dropping to his knees. Echo pressed himself against Caleb's chest without hesitation, curling tight to share his body heat. The shepherd's training came alive, tail thumping once, deliberately. He knew exactly what to do. Thomas leaned over Caleb, fingers searching his neck. A pulse, faint, barely there. Then he shifted to Mike. The deputy's eyes cracked open, fevered, lips trembling. "No!" "No radio," Mike rasped, coughing blood. "They'll find us." His voice cracked. "Wallace, they'll find us." Thomas's jaw tightened. Whoever they were, it didn't matter right now. The snow was falling faster, sealing their tracks. The cold would finish what the bullets had started if he wasted even minutes. "I'm not calling anyone," Thomas said flatly, already, tearing into his hunting pack. "But you're not dying out here." Working fast, he lashed 2 pine branches into a makeshift stretcher, his canvas coat stretched across it. Caleb, unconscious and heavier, went first. Thomas heaved him onto the sled with a grunt, lashing him down tight. Echo stayed with Mike, licking his face to keep him awake, then darted to Thomas's side. The dog tugged at something half buried in the snow, a strip of black fabric torn and soaked with blood. Looked like part of a mask. Echo dropped it at Thomas's boots. Thomas shoved it into his pocket without question. He didn't know what it meant, but Echo had chosen it for a reason. It took nearly an hour to haul both men back to his cabin. The log house sat deep in the trees, lit only by a faint porch light hooked to an old solar panel. Inside, the generator hummed, the fire already throwing heat from the hearth. Thomas dragged Caleb first to the fireside, stripping away his frozen jacket. The bullet wound had clotted, but his body was ice cold. Mike, teeth clenched, was propped against the wall, his legs splinted, flask of spiked tea pressed into his hands. Thomas worked in silence, stitching Caleb's side by firelight while Echo paced anxiously, ears twitching at every gust of wind. "Easy, boy," Thomas muttered. "We've got them now. You did good." By midnight, Caleb's breathing had steadied. Mike drifted in and out, groggy with pain. Somewhere near 2 a.m., Mike stirred again. His words were ragged, barely audible. "Don't trust them," he coughed. "Wallace. They knew." That name, Wallace. It stirred an old memory. Lieutenant Gerald Wallace, Thomas's commanding officer back in Afghanistan. A manipulative, bastard, cruel and cunning. Could it be the same man? Echo lay pressed against Caleb still, his body radiating heat, eyes fixed on the door. He hadn't closed them once. The fire burned low. Then at last, Caleb groaned, his storm-gray eyes flickering open. Sweat dampened his short brown hair, his face pale with exhaustion. "You're safe," Thomas said quietly, leaning forward. "My cabin. I found you in the snow." Caleb tried to push himself up, but gasped, clutching his side. Thomas steadied him with a hand. "Easy. Bullet went through your left side. You lost a lot of blood." Caleb's voice was a rasp. "Where's Mike?" Thomas nodded to the other side of the room. Mike lay propped up on blankets, his broken leg stretched out, jaw tight with pain. "He's stable. Leg's bad, but he'll live." Caleb's gaze softened when it fell on Echo. The dog thumped his tail once, slow and steady. You kept me alive," Caleb whispered, reaching a trembling hand to touch his fur. Echo grunted softly, nudging his arm in reply. Thomas moved to the stove, poured steaming coffee into a tin mug, and handed it over. Caleb sipped, grimacing at the bitterness, but his breathing steadied. "You're lucky we were out there," Thomas said. "Another hour and you'd have been gone." Caleb's eyes sharpened, his voice low. "You didn't call it in, did you?" Thomas raised a brow. "No signal up here. And you told me not to. Why?" Caleb's gaze flicked to Mike. The younger deputy was awake now, silent but listening. Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. Finally, Caleb leaned forward, whispering hoarsely, "There's a rat in the department. Someone fed our location. That ambush. It wasn't random." Mike's voice was harsh but steady. "We were tracking a drug route through these woods. Something big. They hit us in full tack gear, masks, no insignia. One of them said our names before he pulled the trigger." Thomas's gut twisted. "You think someone inside set you up?" Caleb's jaw clenched. "I don't think, I know. I'd bet my badge." He took another shallow breath, eyes sharp. "There's proof. A USB drive, hidden in the lining of Mike's vest. Audio files, photos, everything." Thomas stood abruptly, crossing the cabin to the pile of gear he'd stripped from them the night before. He picked through bloodied jackets, and bent holsters until his hands landed on the vest, turned it over in his hands. Echo trotted beside him and began sniffing the seams near the collar. Thomas noticed the stitching had been loosened slightly along the inside. With a careful tug, he pulled free a tiny black USB stick wrapped in plastic and tape. "This it?" Mike nodded once. Thomas slid it into the pocket of his jacket. "We'll figure out how to access it later." Echo suddenly froze. Ears perked, nose pointed, toward the cabin door. A low, guttural growl built in his chest. Thomas stiffened. The wind howled again, but beneath it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps echoed faintly through the snow outside. He grabbed his rifle and moved silently to the window. Brushing aside the frost with the edge of his sleeve, he scanned the tree line. There barely visible two shadows moving among the pines, slow, deliberate, watching the cabin. Echo was already at the door, tail stiff, body low. "Stay down," Thomas told the others. He cracked the door just enough to slip out, leaving it slightly ajar for Echo. Snow bit at his face, wind stinging his eyes as he crept around the porch to the left, Echo following in near silence. The old training between man and dog required no spoken words. They moved into the trees and circled wide. Thomas spotted the prints first, deep and recent, leading toward a snow-covered boulder. One shadow stood behind, it scanning the cabin with binoculars. Another crouched 10 yards to his right, partially obscured by fallen tree. Echo paused and crouched, hackles rising. Thomas raised his rifle. He wasn't going to fire. Not yet. But the fact that they were there, armed and silent, told him enough. Whoever these men were, they weren't hikers, and they weren't just looking. They were waiting. Thomas and Echo slipped back around the long way and returned to the cabin, unseen. Inside, Mike had managed to sit upright, his face tight with pain. Caleb was already trying to stand. "Stay down," Thomas ordered. "There are 2 of them out there scouting, watching. They came to finish the job," Caleb muttered. "They're making sure we didn't survive." "We're not going to give them the satisfaction," Thomas replied. He grabbed the chain spool from the gear closet, pulled out 3 steel snares and tossed one to Echo, who caught it in his mouth and padded to the rear exit. Thomas began laying traps along the tree line while Echo covered ground, working in silent rhythm, just like they used to on patrol a decade ago. By the time Thisun began to rise, the 2 shadows had vanished, but the footprints remained. They would be back, and next time they'd come in shooting. Thomas closed the cabin door and began hammering boards across the inside of the windows. Echo sat by the fire again, but his eyes didn't blink. They watched the door like a soldier standing. Watch. Morning crept slowly over the Cascade Mountains, bleeding pale gold into the snow-covered forest. Inside the cabin, the scent of smoke and pine lingered in the air, warm and sharp. The fire had been stoked back to life, crackling gently in the hearth. Caleb lay dozing on the cot near the heat, still pale, but his breathing had steadied. Mike, propped up on a stack of folded blankets, stared blankly at the ceiling with a tight jaw and unfocused eyes. Thomas stood at the window with a thermos of lukewarm coffee in hand, eyes scanning the tree-line through the frost. Echo sat by his side, tail still, posture alert. Though hours had passed since the last sign of the intruders, neither man nor dog had truly relaxed. Mike finally spoke, his voice low, dry. It was a setup. Thomas turned slightly. "What do you mean?" Mike shifted, pain flashing across his face as he adjusted his broken leg. He looked over at Caleb, then back to Thomas. "That drop we were sent to. Watch the one out near the quarry trail. Command told us it was a possible dead end. Just a hunch. No backup, just recon. But that wasn't a hunch. Someone knew something was moving through that trail, and they made damn sure no one else would be around when it happened." Thomas moved closer, resting one hand on the back of the wooden chair. "So, You were sent in blind. On purpose? Mike nodded. I've done stings before. I've seen bad calls. This wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. Clean. Quick. Professional Caleb stirred then, eyes fluttering open. His voice was raspy. They were waiting for us. We just found tire tracks near the teary-eyed cargo prints deep. Then two. Flashes. One hit Mike. Another went for the radio. I didn't even see them coming. Thomas lowered himself onto the edge of the table, listening without interruption. Caleb coughed, then continued. It wasn't some random cartel muscle either. They moved like they knew law enforcement tactics, covered every angle. But the worst part, one of them. He hesitated. Mike glanced over. What do you mean? He had the shot. On me. Point blank. I'd already dropped my weapon. He could have finished it. But instead, he looked at the other guy and said, We're not supposed to kill him. Just like that. Like there were instructions, silent, stretched across the room. Thomas broke it. Who gave the order? Caleb stared at the ceiling. Wallace. At that, name. Thomas's knuckles tensed around his coffee mug. Lieutenant Gerald Wallace. The name hadn't been spoken aloud in over a decade. White, mid-50s now, former Army intelligence turned law enforcement. Charismatic in public, meticulous in command, and behind closed doors, ruthless, Thomas had once served under him in Kandahar years ago. Before everything fell apart, before Wallace's decisions left 3 good men dead, and Thomas with a discharge, pinned to a paper thick with silence. You sure? Thomas asked quietly. Caleb nodded. When I tried to push for an arrest, 6 months ago, trafficking case tied to the quarry, Wallace shut it down. Said the evidence wasn't solid. Then here assigned the case to someone who buried it. Same quarry, same route. Mike clenched his jaw. We kept looking anyway. Off the record. Got the audio, then someone leaked our location. Thomas stood. He looked. At Echo, who was watching them with a steady gaze, ears slightly perked. We need supplies, he said. Meat's low and we need something for that leg. He pulled on his jacket, grabbed his knife and old Winchester, and whistled low. Echo stood immediately and padded toward the door. Mike tried to protest. We've got enough. I know what I'm doing, Thomas said. You need protein, and we can't afford to be still too long. Echo's got the nose. I've got the gun. Mike hesitated, then gave Asmal nod. Before leaving, Thomas handed Caleb a small walkie, one of 2 ancient hand radios left over from his military days. Short range only, but enough if something happens. Keep it on channel 3. He stepped outside into the cold. Echo close at his heel. They moved through the snow in silence. The dog walking slightly ahead, nose close to the ground. After 20 minutes of searching for deer trail, Echo veered sharply to the left, tail stiffening. He let out a quiet woof and began walking faster, ears bored. Thomas followed, boots crunching through frost. They reached a frozen creek bed, partially obscured by low branches. Echo stopped near a cluster of broken pine limbs and sniffed hard at something buried in the snow. He dug rapidly, then backed up. Thomas crouched. It wasn't deer. A pistol lay half-submerged beneath the snow. Standard issue Glock 22, partially iced over, its grip wrapped in black tape. But what caught Thomas's breath was the engraving on the barrel just beneath the slide. Mill Creek PD or 4191. He froze. Mill Creek Police Department, his old town. And the badge number 04191, he remembered it. Officer David Franks, a man Thomas once knew. Loyal, quiet, disappeared 6 months ago after putting in a leave request. No one ever said where he went. Thomas picked up the gun carefully, wiping away ice with his sleeve. The trigger was clean, recently fired. Echo watched him closely, then nudged Thomas's thigh. Good boy, Thomas whispered. You found him, didn't you? He scanned the area. No body, note racks that hadn't been covered by fresh snow. Just that gun and a single glove, nearby black tactical size large with a tear across the palm. Echo pawed at the glove, then gently picked it up in his mouth. "We take it back," Thomas said, rising to his feet. "This tells a story someone tried to bury." They returned to the cabin as the sky began to darken again. Inside, Caleb had dozed off once more. Mike was eating a reheated can of stew with a plastic spoon, his face still drawn, but his posture straighter. Thomas laid the gun and glove on Thedible. Mike's eyes widened. "Where'd you get that?" "Frozen creek bed west of Therridge." Thomas said, "Found it. Mill Creek standard issue. This belonged to a man named Franks. He's been missing, or so they claimed." Caleb stirred. "They said Franks went a wool or they made him disappear," Thomas muttered. "Either way, we're sitting on top of a cover-up that goes deeper than just dirty cops. And I have a feeling Wallace is the one threading the needle." Echo lay beside the fire, tail curled around his side, still holding the glove gently in his mouth like it was something sacred. Snow fell in slow spirals from the pine canopy above, muffling the crunch of boots and paws as the group moved through the forest. Thomas led the way, his rifle slung over his shoulder and eyes sweeping the trees ahead. Echo trotted silently beside him, head lowered, nose working through the snow like a precision instrument. Behind them, Caleb limped steadily with the Adolf, a makeshift walking stick wrapped in cloth to soften the pressure on his ribs. Mike followed last, leaning heavily on Thomas's backup cane, his jaw clenched from the pain in his leg. They hadn't meant to leave the cabin so soon, but the discovery of Officer Frank's service weapon had shifted the scale. Caleb had insisted the old mine was worth checking an abandoned site carved into the ridge just north of the logging trails. It had come up in several reports over the past year, always as background noise, never worth more than a footnote. But now, with Wallace's name surfacing and a list of coincidences growing far too neat, they couldn't ignore it. The group stopped, at the edge of a clearing ringed with blackened stumps and snow-covered gravel. Ahead, the land sloped upward into a steep hill dotted with derelict mining structures. One of them, a rusted storage shack with warped tin siding, stood like a forgotten outpost at the base of a cliff. A collapsed cart rail-snaked from its side into the trees like a vein once full of motion now gone cold. Caleb pointed with his stick. "That's where we found packaging traces, syringes, shipping tape, burned wrappers. Last time we checked, it was empty." Mike scanned the perimeter. "Looks the same, but if they used it before, they might still be using it." Thomas said nothing, but his steps slowed as he studied the tracks in the snow. Faint tire marks curved toward the shack, mostly filled in by recent snowfall, but still discernible to someone who'd hunted through worse. Echo stopped at the shack's entrance and growled low. Thomas moved beside him and saw what the dog had noticed. A heavy steel chain looped through the door handle, secured with a padlock. But the lock wasn't new. It was rusted, clearly broken once and rethreaded into place, more for show than security. He knelt down, motioned Echo back, and lifted the lock, gently. With a twist, it came open without resistance. Inside the shack, the air was thick with stale chemicals and damp earth. It smelled of oil, mildew, and faintly, unmistakably acetone. Mike coughed from behind. "Yeah, they've used this." Thomas turned on his flashlight. The beam sliced through the dark, revealing overturned crates, a rotting table, and in one corner, a broken folding chair with duct tape wrapped around the legs. A small security camera was bolted into the far corner, its lens cracked, but intact. Wires had been ripped from the wall, but not fully destroyed. The hard drive casing was still mounted under the shelf, half covered in dirt. Caleb limped over. "Looks like they got sloppy." Thomas crouched by the camera or left in a hurry. Echo nosed his way past a torn tarp in the back. He barked once, sharp and urgent. Thomas followed. Behind the tarp, tucked into a shallow crevice in the wall, was a black duffel bag, unzipped, but still mostly full. Inside were several sealed packages wrapped in plastic, stamped with black ink, and labeled only with a crude logo, a coiled snake, and the number 16, Mike exhaled. Fentanyl. That's what they've been pushing. Thomas pulled out a small folded paper, stuffed between the packets. It was damp, the ink slightly smeared but still legible. Wallace, December 16th, Site C3 lines. That was all, but it was enough. Caleb read over his shoulder and palled. That's next week. Mike looked at Thomas. They're planning another transfer. Thomas pocketed the note. Then we don't have much time. Echo pawed at the dirt again. Thomas glanced down and noticed something strange in the thin layer of dust beneath. The tarp next to the bag were paw prints, but they weren't Echo's. He knelt, studying them, smaller, closer together, still deep, meaning recent. He ran his hand through the print, noting the familiar triangular shape of a shepherd's paw, but the gait was uneven, like one leg had been dragging. Another dog, Thomas muttered. Hurt. Caleb furrowed his brow. They're using K9s now. Mike shook his head. Not officially. No new units deployed to this region. If there was one, it's off record, or it's been left behind. Echo padded up beside Thomas and sniffed the print again. Then he let out a low, curious whine. Thomas reached over and scratched behind his ears. You feel that too, huh? Mike stepped carefully around the tarp, looking down. Could be one of the dogs from the old unit. They retired 2 years ago. Could have been picked up by someone dirty. Caleb gritted his teeth, or taken from someone. The thought hung heavy in the cold air. A working dog, trained and loyal, repurposed by the wrong hands. It didn't sit right with any of them, especially Echo, who began circling the room slowly, sniffing, every surface, ears twitching. Thomas turned back to the camera. If this still has footage, we might get a look at who came here last. Mike moved to inspect it. I can pull the drive if you've got a knife. Thomas handed over his utility blade. Mike knelt with practiced care and began loosening the mount. Outside, a sudden rustle made Echo whirl. Everyone froze. Echo ran to the door but didn't bark, just stood still, nose pointed outward. Thomas crept. To the entrance, rifle raised. The wind had shifted. Branches squeaked overhead. A raven flapped upward from the snow with a loud cry, wings slicing the air, but nothing moved beyond that. Caleb whispered, "Too quiet." Thomas nodded. "We're being watched." But nothing more came. They exited the shack together, leaving the chain, loosely draped to look intact. Thomas held the duffel close. Mike carried the detached hard drive in his coat. Caleb tucked the Wallace December 16th note into his pocket. Echo kept his head on a swivel the entire way back. None of them said it aloud, but they all felt the same thing, that their trail had just intersected with something deeper, more dangerous. Back at the cabin, they locked the door and boarded the windows tighter. Echo lay by the fire again, but his nose twitched every time the wind shifted. The wind howled through the towering pines like an omen. It was past midnight, and the cabin lay in uneasy silence. The embers in the hearth had cooled, casting the room in deep shadows. Outside, the forest shifted with every gust. Branches creaked. Leaves rustled, and somewhere far off, a coyote called. Inside the cabin, Thomas sat upright in the armchair, eyes sharp. He hadn't slept. Not really. He kept one hand on the hunting rifle across his lap, the other wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. Echo lay by the door, ears twitching. Caleb rested. On the couch, bandages across his ribs, his breathing shallow but steady. Mike, now stronger, leaned against the wall in the back room, an old revolver by his side. Then Echo lifted her head. Her muscles tensed, nose flared, and her tail went rigid. In a blink, she was on her feet, facing the back window. Thomas followed her gaze. A shadow moved. He whispered, "Mike, up!" Now. But it was Echo who moved first. With a low growl, she bolted toward Caleb, nipping his arm until he stirred. "Echo, what?" Caleb winced. "Get up! We're not alone!" Thomas hissed, already striding to the door. "Mike, cover the east window!" As Caleb staggered to his feet, Echo darted to the back of the cabin and began pawing at the floorboard under the coat rack. Thomas realized what she meant. "There's a trap door," he muttered. He pulled it open. An old emergency hatch. Caleb in Echo. Go. Before Caleb could lower himself, the first shot cracked the air. A window exploded into shards. A bullet struck the pantry door behind Thomas. "Down!" Mike shouted, returning fire toward the tree-eyed. Caleb dropped through the hatch just as Echo leapt in beside him. Thomas fired his rifle twice into the dark, not aiming to hit, but to distract. Then he followed, closing the hatch above his head. The crawl space beneath the cabin was narrow and damp, filled with the scent of pine sap and old earth. Echo led. The way, nose low, to the ground until they emerged behind a fallen log about 50 yards from the cabin. They crouched in the shadows, the cabin barely visible through the dark. Muffled gunfire echoed Mike, still inside, buying time. Thomas grabbed Caleb's arm. "Can you run? Enough! Then follow Echo." "She knows where to go." They moved like ghosts through the forest. The wind covered their footsteps, but their breaths came in ragged gasps. Echo led them along a ridge, then veered down an arrow path toward an old ranger station. Abandoned, but still standing. A half-burnt American flag hung from the eaves. It took 15 minutes to reach it. The station was a small wooden building, with broken shutters and vines crawling up its sides. Thomas pushed open the door, flashlight in hand. The inside smelled of dust and pine resin. Maps still lined the walls, and an old desk sat beneath a cobwebbed window. But they weren't alone. A click sounded. "Don't move," came a woman's voice, calm, low but firm. Thomas slowly turned to see a tall woman in her late 30s, standing behind the desk with a Glock aimed directly at his chest. She had coppery brown hair tied back into a practical knot, sharp hazel eyes, and wore a forest green tactical jacket with the faded letters FBI on the shoulder. "Rachel Brooks," she said. "Identify yourself." Thomas raised both hands slowly. Thomas. "Grayson, ex-Marine. This is Officer Caleb Hart. We were attacked. Why are you here? Because Echo led us here." The moment Rachel's eyes fell on the German Shepherd, her expression shifted. Echo stepped forward cautiously, ears forward, tail low. Rachel's mouth parted in surprise, and slowly she lowered her weapon. "Echo," she whispered, kneeling. "Is that really you?" Echo let out a soft whine and pressed her head into Rachel's chest. The tension in the room dissolved. Rachel hugged the dog tight. "I thought you were gone." Thomas watched, stunned. "You know her?" "She was mine years ago. We trained together in Quantico Search and Rescue Division. I thought she died during an operation in Arizona. She disappeared during a fire. I never stopped looking." Caleb sat on the floor, catching his breath. Echo. Saved us both. Thomas glanced at the woman. "Rachel, you said you were FBI. Why are you out here alone?" She stood. "Because someone in my own unit betrayed me. Intercepted a signal, a coded message sent on an old military frequency. That's how I found this place." "I sent that," Thomas admitted, "from a field radio we dug up." Rachel nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad I came. You were right not to trust anyone else." Footsteps suddenly pounded up the trail outside. Thomas raised his rifle again until a familiar voice shouted, "Don't shoot! It's me!" Mike burst through the door, scratched and muddy but alive. I took out one. The others retreated after a few. "Shots," he panted. "But they'll be back. They weren't here to kill. They were probing, testing our defense." "Then we need to hit back," Rachel said grimly. "And fast." As she spoke, Echo growled. She had sniffed Mike's jacket and bolted toward a bloodied rag stuffed in his pocket. "What's that?" Thomas asked. Mike pulled it out. "It's from the guy Echo took. Down." She bit deep inside. The rag was a folded slip of paper, moist, but still legible. Rachel unfolded it, her jaw tightened. It read, December 16th, last transfer before shutdown. Mill Creek. But more chilling were the initials signed at the bottom. Wallace, Caleb muttered. Echo let out a sharp bark. They now had confirmation. The enemy was closer than they feared. The morning sun broke gently through the pine canopy, scattering gold onto the forest floor. But inside the ranger station, the light felt far away, as though the cabin remained suspended in the uneasy chill of night. Dust swirled in beams of sunlight filtering through cracked windows. Rachel stood near the old map wall, hands on her hips, studying the pinned coordinates. Her hazel eyes, normally sharp and controlled, now carried something closer to dread. "I've been trailing this network for 2 years," she said quietly. "We always got close. Then something would blow the whole thing up. I thought I was cursed, but now I know it wasn't bad luck." Thomas leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "Inside sabotage?" Rachel nodded. "From higher up, state level, Department of Justice, someone with access, clearance, and the ability to scrub everything we gather." Caleb, still pale and limping from the earlier ambush, sat on an overturned crate. "How can we take them down if they can bury anything we find?" "We expose them," Rachel said firmly. "Not just the cartel, the entire pipeline, starting with Wallace. That note with his initial and the transfer date, December 16th. It's our way in." Echo, lying near the hearth, perked her ears. The moment Rachel pulled out her field bag and began sorting equipment, Echo rose and walked over, tail high, eyes alert. Rachel paused, looking down at the German shepherd who once trained beside her through endless dawn drills and disaster simulations. "You still remember, don't you?" she murmured. From the bag, she drew out a black tactical canine vest, old worn but freshly stitched. On the side, the faded white letters still read FBISAR 19. She knelt and fitted the vest onto Echo. The straps adjusted perfectly as though no time had passed at all. Echo stood proud, her tail still head high. "This was yours," Rachel whispered. "Your last assignment." Echo turned her head toward Thomas and gave a soft bark as if acknowledging the shift. She wasn't just surviving now, she was back on duty. Returning to the cabin was risky, but it was necessary. They left just before noon. The walk back was silent, tense. Mike stayed behind at the ranger station to monitor the area and keep radio contact. Rachel, Thomas, and Caleb moved through the underbrush with Echo scouting ahead. When they reached the cabin, the damage was visible. Broken window panes, bullet holes peppering the outer wall, the front door hanging slightly off hinge. Rachel motioned for quiet as she crept in first, sidearm drawn. Echo followed, nose to the floor. The cabin was empty. Rachel made straight for the back wall where she had spotted a mounted smoke detector during their last visit. It wasn't connected to anything. She unscrewed it and pulled it down inside. A miniature pinhole camera blinked faintly red. Thomas stepped closer. Someone left it here. Rachel nodded grimly, and it was still recording. She popped out the micro SD card and slotted it into a portable reader from her vest pocket. A faint were a green light. Then the screen showed grainy footage of the interior of the cabin at night, motionless until movement. A tall figure entered through the back, balding, broad-shouldered, dark overcoat. Caleb swore under his breath. That's him. Rachel's jaw tightened. Wallace. The footage showed Wallace rifling through the cabinet, placing something beneath a loose floorboard, then stepping out the door again. Thomas lifted the floorboard. Beneath it, still there, was a sealed plastic pouch. Inside, a burner phone and a folded map marked with red tape. Rachel snapped a photo. He's preparing the drop. Caleb leaned forward. We have proof. Real traceable proof. Thomas wasn't smiling. Proof means nothing if we don't survive long enough to get it out. Back at the station, Mike greeted them with a half smirk and a steaming pot of instant coffee. We're still ghosts out here. No signs of a return party, but we won't have that luxury for long. They gathered at the central table, laying out all they had. The footage, the note from Wallace's man, the burner phone's call logs, and now the map. Rachel turned to Caleb. You were there the night of the ambush. You saw Wallace's face. You're willing to testify? Caleb nodded, jaw clenched. Yes. She looked to Mike. You were with him when Echo took down the courier. You saw the rag, the coded message. Mike shrugged, his voice quieter. I'm no hero, but yeah, I saw it. I'll speak. Rachel exhaled slowly. Then it's decided on the 16th. We intercept the handoff. Wallace will be there. We record, expose, and deliver it to a federal judge I trust personally. Off-grid. No servers. No delays. Thomas, who had been silent until then, rose and stepped to the back corner. From an old filing cabinet, he withdrew a battered folder, its label faded by time and weather. He handed it to Rachel. Something you might want to see, he said. Inside were photocopies of a long-forgotten report detailing cartel activity along the Western Pipeline, including names, coordinates, methods. At the bottom of each page was the signature of T. Grayson. Rachel blinked. You wrote this 10 years ago, Thomas said. I sent it up the chain. 2 weeks later, I was told to stand down. A month later, I was discharged. Rachel's fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages. It connects. The patterns, the drops, even the aliases, same as now. They buried it because it pointed to Wallace, Thomas said. I didn't know who he was back then. Now I do. Rachel closed the folder with quiet resolve. Then we finish what they tried to bury. Echo barked once. The team turned to her. She stood by the door, tail wagging slowly, eyes locked onto the path beyond, as if she knew the road ahead was dark, but they wouldn't be walking it alone. The gray light of dawn crept over the skeletal ridgel lines of the abandoned mining complex. It was December 16th, cold enough to still the breath and stiffen even the most iron nerves. A low fog laced between the blackened frames of crumbling machinery and rusted conveyor belts. Ghosts of a forgotten era now hosting the most dangerous game of all. Hidden in the hills above the clearing, Thomas knelt silently in a faded green jacket and wool gloves, a battered field radio at his side. His weathered face was calm, but the scar along his right jaw, old, pale but unmistakable, seemed to glow beneath the overcast sky. Echo. The 10-year-old German shepherd crouched beside him, eyes fixed ahead, every muscle coiled. The K9 vest strapped to his chest shimmered with tactical sheen, a symbol of duty reborn. Mike stood further downhill, partially hidden behind a collapsed supply shack. His breath fogged in steady bursts. His pistol, a matte black Glock, rested loosely in his hand, though his eyes were tight, tracking the motion of the SUV approaching the clearing. Rachel was stationed near the tree-line, dressed in full FBI tactical gear, tall, composed, and sharp-eyed. She gripped a small recorder in her gloved hand. Behind her, 2 other agents waited for the cue. The SUV rolled to a halt on gravel, kicking dust and cold mist into the air. 4 men stepped out. At the front, clean-cut, and draped in a black overcoat, was Wallace Deputy Chief Wallace. Broad-shouldered, eyes like a blade, his every movement still carried the elegance of someone who knew he'd long evaded consequences. Flanking him were 3 men in dark tactical jackets, armed and alert. One of them held a metal briefcase. Rachel whispered into her mic, "Visual on Wallace. No sign of the buyer yet." Thomas tapped to the side of his headset. "Hold position. Let the scene unfold." Wallace walked toward the center of the clearing. "You said he'd be here," he barked at one of his men. "He will," the man muttered, but it wasn't the buyer. Thomas and the others were watching. Echo suddenly tensed beside Thomas, his ears flicking toward the northern ridge. Thomas leaned low. "What is it, boy?" Echo sniffed. Low growl building in his throat. Then Thomas saw it. The faint shimmer of glass. A sniper scope. Hidden behind an outcropping of stone near the ridgel line, a fifth man lay prone, his rifle trained toward the meeting point. The glint was brief, but it was enough. Without a sound, Echo launched forward. Down in the clearing, Wallace's voice rose. "If the informant doesn't show, we bury this and reschedule. I don't have time for a scream," echoed from the ridge. The gunman hadn't seen Echo coming. The dog hit him like a shadow, teeth clamping onto his forearm before the man could line up the shot. The rifle clattered. The man howled, rolling downhill in a tangle of limbs and snow-dusted dirt. The chaos below erupted instantly. Shots fired. Rachel called, "Go! Go! Go!" FBI agents broke from cover. Rachel surged forward. Mike ducked out from the shack, firing a warning shot into the air as one of Wallace's men raised his weapon. In the midst of the fray, Wallace grabbed the briefcase and shouted, "Take them out!" One of his men turned his rifle toward a third-party figure standing awkwardly beside the SUV, a young man in civilian clothes. He was the courier, an undercover agent posing as a former smuggler willing to turn. The man froze in terror. "No," Wallace barked. He'd seen too much. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Wallace's team. Thomas had slipped closer during the confusion and now stood behind a stack of crates holding up his phone. "This entire conversation's been recorded, Wallace." Wallace turned, his eyes narrowing. You used to teach me about justice," Thomas said calmly. "Guess I paid more attention than you thought." Wallace raised his pistol, but Echo emerged again from the mist, teeth bared, flanking him from the side. Before Wallace could pull the trigger, 2 FBI agents tackled him from behind. Caleb, meanwhile, had seen Rachel take a hit, just a graze across her arm, but it bled through her jacket. As another of Wallace's men took aim at her exposed flank, Caleb darted out, shoving her behind a collapsed barrel and returning fire. His shoulder took the recoil and the shot missed, but it forced the gunman to retreat. "You all right?" Caleb asked. Rachel, wincing, nodded. "You saved my life?" he offered, a breathless smile. "Just evening theft score." Once the dust settled, Wallace and his team were zip-tied and disarmed. The buyer had never shown it had all been a trap. The real buyer had been tipped off, or perhaps never existed, but Wallace's confession and actions caught clearly on Rachel's high-gain recorder and Thomas's backup device were enough. An agent approached Thomas with restrained awe. "You trained him yourself?" he asked, gesturing to Echo. Thomas nodded, wiping the blood from Echo's muzzle. "Retired years ago, but some scars don't fade. They just teach us where to bite." Later, before they left the site, the entire FBI team formed a brief line near the armored vehicle. One by one, they nodded at Echko as he passed. One agent knelt and whispered, "Thank you, soldier." The old dog wagged his tail, once slow, steady, and proud. The courtroom in Mill Creek was packed. The weight of months of investigation, near death, escapes, and whispered truths finally burst into the open beneath solemn chandeliers and the eyes of the law. Judge Halderman, an aging man with silver hair and a firm voice, presided with grim clarity. Behind the prosecution bench stood Rachel, Brooks crisp in a navy blazer, her auburn hair neatly tied, presenting the case with the precision of someone who had lost sleep and earned scars. Wallace sat shackled in the defendant's chair, the sharpness in his eyes dulled, a man cornered by his own misdeeds. Alongside him were 2 men from his inner circle, the very ones Echo had helped identify. The charges were read aloud like hammer strikes: conspiracy to traffic narcotics, obstruction of federal investigation, attempted murder of a law enforcement officer, destruction of federal evidence. Caleb sat in the witness box with a bandage still on his arm from the scuffle at the quarry. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of betrayal and resolve. He recounted Wallace's role, the fake arrests, the night he was left bleeding on the forest floor. Mike followed, his once muted voice now firm. He wore high-soled patrol uniform again for the first time in years. The badge gleamed against the navy. Fabric, not just a symbol of duty, but of redemption. The footage from the camera hidden in the cabin played across the courtroom screen. Wallace giving orders, threats whispered into the shadows, and finally the moment Thomas's recording captured the plan to silence the traitor delivery man. It was damning and definitive. When the verdict came down guilty on all counts, there was no applause, only a silence filled with breath released and burdens lifted. Later that week, a quiet ceremony was held at the Mill Creek Police Department. The sky was soft with overcast light as officers, agents, and townsfolk gathered in front of the precinct. Rachel, standing at the microphone, read out the commendations. Thomas. Grayson was declared an honorary citizen of Mill Creek for exceptional courage and unwavering pursuit of justice. His eyes, usually reserved, shimmered as he accepted the small plaque with trembling hands. The trauma of exile was behind him now. Mill Creek, no longer a place of shame, but of renewal. Caleb, dressed in a sharp gray blazer and pressed slacks, was introduced as the newest instructor at the State Police Training Academy. A young boy waved from the crowd. It was Liam, the boy who had aunts feared everything. He now stood with his foster family, smiling, wearing a junior police cap. Mike, no longer an exile or ghost, was officially reinstated as a law enforcement advisor for the town. Though he would not return to the beat, his quiet wisdom was needed in other ways. As Sheriff Harland pinned the insignia back on Mike's lapel, they shared a brief nod of forgiveness and mutual respect, and then came the moment everyone awaited. Rachel stepped forward, her hand resting gently on the head of Echo, the 10-year-old German shepherd who stood tall despite the graying fur along, his jaw and the stiff leg that bore the memory of an old bullet wound. Echo wore a polished black vest, not for combat, but for honor. A silver medallion hung around his neck, engraved with the words, K9 Valor Uniteco. "Few have done more to protect this town," Rachel said, her voice catching. "Echo's instincts, loyalty, and courage saved lives. This is his last mission, but his legacy will outlive us all." Echo was then given a final command by Caleb, whispered with affection. "At ease, hero." The dog sat proudly beside him, as if he understood everything. As the ceremony ended, a carved wooden statue was unveiled, crafted by a local artisan from Cedar. It depicted Echo mid-leap, eyes sharp, ears alert, symbolizing his bravery. It stood proudly at the entrance to the precinct, a guardian in wood, forever watching. Later, back at the cabin on the ridge, evening fell in amber shades. Thomas stood by the porch railing, watching the last golden rays skim the treetops. Rachel had just left, her car's tires crunching away on gravel after proposing the creation of the Echo Unit, a volunteer-led task force comprising retired K9 and veterans willing to use their experience for unsolved rural cases. Thomas had agreed to help train them. "Not all scars are seen," she had said, placing a hand over his shoulder before departing. Caleb sat nearby, tossing a stick down the slope. Echo chased after it with surprising speed for his age, the vest now removed, his back fur free in the wind. He brought it back and lay down with a huff of contentment. Inside the cabin, a small plaque now hung on the wall above the old radio, the very one Thomas used to send his encrypted call for help. It read, "Truth endures where courage resides." The three of them, Caleb, Thomas, and Echo, sat in the hush of twilight. No need for words. The battle was over. The forest was quiet. The scars would fade, but the bonds built in fire would remain. Echo lifted his head one last time, eyes locked, on the forest from which he had once dragged a bleeding man to safety. That same forest now whispered only peace. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles wrapped in thunder or glory. Sometimes he sends them in the form of a wounded dog, a forgotten veteran, or a stranger who chooses to care. This story reminds us that healing can grow in the most broken places, and that no matter how far we fall, redemption is never beyond reach. Echo's bark, Caleb's second chance, and Thomas's courage weren't accidents. They were threads in a divine plan stitched by unseen hands. In our daily lives, we may pass by people or animals who carry silent burdens. Look closely. Reach out, because you might just be the miracle they've been praying for. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Comment Amen if you believe God still works through ordinary people and faithful animals. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because stories like these remind us that light always finds a way through. May God bless you and all those you